The campaign for the release of Madiba took on an unprecedented international momentum. Attesting to the diplomatic prowess of Oliver Tambo, apartheid was described as a crime against humanity by the United Nations. Now, it was important that Madiba be able to promote the society that he envisioned after apartheid. And to speak to us about this is an expert of note. He is from the Mapungubwe Institute, a man of great note, David Maimela. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Sure, thanks.
Now, David, I mean, what Tammy said really resonates with me. I mean, this was the largest human rights campaign in the known world, in known history. How did it gain such momentum? How did this man's face end up being the brand for this particular campaign?
He really was the poster child for the liberation of people of color around the world.
Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, Nelson Mandela comes from a very distinguished generation of leaders. And also comes from a very proud history and line of leaders that have emerged over decades. We can take it back to the late 19th century global Pan-African movement, which included the likes of Du Bois in America and elsewhere in the world. And later on here in South Africa as well, inspired by those kind of Pan-African ideas. Pixlika Isakaseme gave the Pan-African speech in 1906, which spoke very profoundly about the need of a united and free African continent. And this is taken further again to the African claims of the mid-1940s, which actually propounded the idea of an independent sovereign Africa, because you remember that the Western nations had put together what they called the Atlantic Charter. So as a response, then African leaders had to respond in that way. And later on, in 1955, the Freedom Charter then spoke about there must be a need for peace and friendship among nations of the world. So that's the kind of history and that's the kind of struggle and principles. So at a certain point, every revolution requires a face and requires a name that it must promote globally. So what they understood was that we cannot succeed in defeating the apartheid system if we still have the rest of the world supporting it in various ways, through trade, through diplomatic relations, through economic cooperation, through political links and so on. So that campaign of the international campaign focused on Nelson Mandela as a representative of those prisoners, of those struggle heroes that were both inside prison and those that were outside the country in exile.
And that's very important, I think, for us as a nation and as a people and even the international community to know and remember that he was a representation of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of others who were also going through exactly the same situation. But only one man and only one voice is needed to represent. So let us not forget our struggle veterans. Let us forget those whose blood was also shed for the very same dream and same vision.
And also, I suppose, let us not forget those who also contributed so richly. I mean, today, it was really incredible to see through the funeral, other African countries saying, this is our contribution.
Yes.
And I suppose many South Africans are going to be looking at these countries, Malawi in particular, Zambia, Tanzania, and many other African countries very, very differently after this. What is our obligation as South Africans towards these countries, towards the rest of the continent?
Well, we have a responsibility to make sure that South Africa consolidates its efforts to reintegrate in the continent, which is the work that the first cabinet had to deal with. Remember that for many decades, South Africa was isolated from the rest of the continent, partly because the apartheid regime had used its security machinery to destabilize southern Africa and other parts of the continent through various military campaigns and through sabotage, through withdrawing trade relations and so on. Because mainly some of these countries were supporting and harboring the ANC, Lusaka, for instance, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and so, the Wanki and the Sipolilo campaigns, and so on. So the African continent was seen as enemy to the apartheid regime, and the apartheid regime saw the rest of the continent as harboring these terrorists that want to destabilize South Africa. So the role of the first government really was to reintroduce and reintegrate South Africa back into where it belongs, which is the African continent, and play that role of reconstruction and development instead of destabilization.
Thank you so much for just putting all of that into context for us. But right now, I'd like us to cross over to political analyst Dr. Somadoda Figeni, who is going to join us. Actually, he's in Kunu right now, right? Yeah, he's on hybrid, and he'll be joining us in Kunu. So, Dr. Somadoda Figeni, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you to your viewers, and thank you for you to invite me to the studio.
Now, how are you, Doctor? What is the mood on the ground there in Kun?
Well, you'll always remember that the mood is so subdued, and also amongst the villagers, there is a sense of disbelief because they are saying we really are beginning to realize how big this person was in our midst. Because we never thought, even though we knew he was a giant, that he was a global icon.
That is so true, Dr. Figeni. I think you never really know until it's all over. But we've been chatting here in the studio about the identity of being African. And there was a phase where we were all talking about the African Renaissance. But that has since now shifted. And the phrase of the day, one could say, is the African century. What is the difference between these two, and what exactly is the African century all about?
Well, it depends on the content that you give to each one of these concepts, because once you define the program that's going to advance those, it may just be the same or it may be distinct. The African Renaissance, in essence, was to look at how Africans who had contributed to the human civilization and were part of the greatness of humanity, at one stage even leading in some key areas of science, of religion, of education, declined over time. And then when you talk African Renaissance, you are both trying to revive that which was great about Africans, but also infuse that into the modern context, which is key. So that is the mainstay of the African Renaissance.
Now, Doctor, you know, a couple of days ago we had the huge memorial at FNB Stadium, and I think there were a number of critics after that who said it's a bit of a bricks memorial. Today we see that the funeral happened to be a bit of an African affair. What is the message that South Africa would have been sending? What message is the world taking away from how both the memorial and, of course, the funeral were conducted?
Well, I do think that the memorial was more of a world stage for world leaders, with leaders from all the regions, starting with the multilateral organization, the United Nations, being given a stage there, the AU, and the BRICS countries and the countries from the different regions. So that one was more of a global affair, so to speak. Also acknowledging the role that the world had played in the liberation of South Africa and in the reintegration of South Africa from being a pariah into being part of the international community, something that Madiba led. And the tributes today during the service, the funeral service, were more African affair, and I'm certain that it was meant to acknowledge the role that African countries played in supporting the liberation struggle. And as such, you saw that with the presentation by the president of Tanzania, the president of Zambia, the former president of Zambia, Kaunda, and also the SADC element. So I think it was more African in its focus here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Somadoda Figeni, for joining us. You know, after a service such as today with luminaries of the African continent, Madiba once again did something.
Yeah.
He once again said, I dream of an Africa that is at peace with itself. And I think a ceremony such as today was a really huge step in ensuring that that actually does become a reality. But we'll be right back after this break.